The files you are about to hear were never meant to surface. They come from locked archives, sealed basements, and whispered exchanges between men who lived long enough to regret what they had seen. Buried for decades under the weight of official silence, these records tell us of operations and agreements that rewrote history from the shadows. They reveal experiments not conducted on battlefields, but in laboratories disguised as medical clinics. They speak of secret pacts struck in quiet rooms while cities burned. They detail how war criminals were protected, their pasts rewritten, their knowledge repurposed for new empires rising from the ashes of Europe. And they uncover hidden armies, funded by our own governments, whose actions blurred the line between security and terror. Together, these fragments form a chilling mosaic. 4 forbidden World War II secrets, still too dangerous to be fully acknowledged today. They are not myths, but carefully documented betrayals, suppressed to protect nations, industries, and reputations. To understand them is to confront the darkest corners of modern history, where the official record is silent and the truth remains locked under the word classified. Chapter 1. Classified Atrocities of Unit 731. In the frozen plains of Manchuria, far from the eyes of the international press and shielded by the fog of total war, a facility operated that would later become synonymous with unspoken horrors. The name Unit 731 was whispered only within the circles of Japan's Imperial Army, buried behind euphemisms like Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. To the outside world, it suggested hygiene, medicine, and sanitation. But the reality, preserved only in fragments of testimonies, intercepted communications, and long-sealed intelligence reports, tells of crimes that would shame even the most hardened executioners of the 20th century. Between 1936 and 1945, under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 conducted human experimentation on an industrial scale. Prisoners of war, Chinese civilians, Soviet captives, and at times even Japanese dissenters were fed into the machinery of science twisted beyond morality. They were not referred to as men or women in official reports, only as logs, stripped of identity, reduced to mere numbers for tables of data. The camp at Pingfang, near Harbin, was constructed with the precision of a fortress. High fences topped with barbed wire encircled sprawling complexes of laboratories, crematoria, and barracks. Armed guards patrolled the perimeters. Within its walls, thousands of men, women, and children were marched to their deaths under the guise of research. Weather reports from Harbin between 1940 and 1943 describe winters that plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. It was in those conditions that frostbite experiments were carried out. Prisoners were forced to expose limbs to the cold until flesh hardened into ice. Guards would strike their arms with wooden sticks, listening for the hollow sound of frozen flesh. Then, while the victims still breathed, surgeons dissected the tissue to study the stages of gangrene and necrosis. Notes survive in fragments, describing observations on circulation recovery, written with a clinical detachment that belied the suffering endured. Plague was another obsession. Unit 731's researchers deliberately bred fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. They released them into sealed chambers where prisoners were confined. Others were injected directly with cholera, typhoid, or anthrax. Those who survived initial infection were often subjected to vivisection. Without anesthesia, their organs removed in sequence to track disease progression. Women were forced into pregnancies, their unborn children exposed to pathogens, while data was meticulously logged. Such experiments were rationalized as preparation for biological warfare, a weapon more insidious than any bomb. And indeed, in 1940 and 1941, Japanese forces conducted field tests, dropping plague-infected fleas from aircraft over Chinese cities such as Ningbo and Changde. The epidemics that followed killed thousands, their origins disguised as natural outbreaks in official reports. What makes this chapter of history still dangerous is not only the acts themselves, but the silence that followed. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the evidence at Pingfang was systematically destroyed. Prisoners were executed, buildings burned, and records ordered into flames. Yet fragments survived, enough for Soviet investigators to piece together a case. During the Khabarovsk war crime trials in 1949, 12 Japanese officers were tried for bacteriological warfare. Testimonies described in chilling detail the infections, the dissections, the field experiments. The Soviet tribunal sentenced them to prison terms, but outside the USSR, the trials were dismissed in Western media as propaganda. The deeper truth lay not in Moscow but in Washington. Declassified US Army documents reveal why Unit 731 remains shrouded. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied powers in Japan, received reports from his intelligence officers about Ishii's work. Instead of prosecuting, he authorized secret negotiations. The terms were simple: immunity in exchange for research data. By 1947, American scientists at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the heart of US biological warfare research, were poring over files smuggled from Japan. Test results obtained from torture and death were rebranded as valuable contributions to science. Internal memoranda, marked top secret, recommended withholding these findings from public and Allied scrutiny. Ishii himself lived out his days quietly in Tokyo, never tried, never punished, dying in 1959 as a respected member of Japan's medical community. His colleagues took positions in universities, government agencies, and private companies. The legacy of Unit 731 dissolved into the bloodstream of modern institutions. Eyewitness accounts that surfaced decades later reinforced the scale of horror. Former guards admitted to burning thousands of bodies in crematoria that smoked day and night. Survivors described being injected with horse blood, gasoline, or seawater to test compatibility with human physiology. Still others recalled being subjected to pressure chambers until their eyes burst, or locked into experimental centrifuges that spun at fatal speeds. Yet even today, no official recognition has been offered by the Japanese government. Victims' families, particularly in China, continue to demand acknowledgement and reparations, often meeting silence or denial. The moral weight of Unit 731's legacy lies not only in its atrocities, but in the decision of powerful nations to suppress them. Documents buried under US Army Code references, such as File 120-776, interrogation of Japanese scientists, testify to deliberate concealment. Soviet archives declassified only after the fall of the USSR corroborate these exchanges. The full scope of data collected has never been disclosed, fueling speculation that some findings remain in classified programs even today. Biological warfare conventions signed in later decades emerged in part as a response to whispers of such crimes, but their deterrent value is compromised when the perpetrators walk free, their crimes erased in the name of national interest. What haunts historians and investigators alike is the question of precedent. If the data from Unit 731 influenced Cold War biological research, then countless projects in the United States and beyond carry the taint of that origin. Fort Detrick's early experiments in aerosolized pathogens, the Korean War accusations of bacteriological attacks, even later programs in Vietnam, all cast long shadows back to Pingfang. Officially, no admission has been made. Unofficially, fragments of correspondence, memoranda, and survivor testimony suggest otherwise. The victims, stripped of identity, remain buried in unmarked graves across Manchuria, while the men who killed them became silent architects of modern science and defense. The story of Unit 731 is not just a dark corner of Japanese militarism, but a global scandal woven into the fabric of post-war power. It is a reminder that victory in war often comes at the price of moral compromise, and that truth can be buried not by the defeated, but by the victors who find it inconvenient. Sealed archives and redacted files protect reputations, but they cannot silence the echoes of the crematoria, the frostbitten limbs, or the silent screams of men and women dissected alive in the name of progress. To confront Unit 731 is to confront the fragility of justice itself, how easily it can be traded away, and how deeply that trade continues to shape the world we live in today. Chapter 2: Forbidden Pact Beneath the Reich. In the spring of 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Berlin was a shattered skeleton of streets, the Reichstag smouldering under Soviet artillery, and the once mighty Wehrmacht collapsing into scattered remnants. Yet behind the smoke and rubble, in quiet hotels and secluded chalets in neutral Switzerland, a different kind of war was being fought. Its codenames, preserved in OSS memoranda and MI6 fragments, carry titles like Operation Sunrise and Operation Eclipse. These files describe not battlefield maneuvers, but clandestine negotiations between Allied intelligence officers and representatives of the collapsing Third Reich. It was here, in the shadows, that certain Nazi officials sought guarantees, not for Germany, but for themselves, their wealth, and their vision of survival beyond defeat. What emerged from these talks was not written into history books. Instead, it was sealed behind the word classified, buried in diplomatic cables and intelligence briefings that would not surface. until decades later. At the center of these negotiations stood men like SS General Karl Wolff, Heinrich Himmler's former chief of staff, who quietly contacted Allen Dulles, then the OSS station chief in Bern. Wolff promised intelligence on Soviet positions and troop strengths in exchange for leniency. He carried with him not only military secrets, but also access to networks of industrialists tied to Germany's war economy. These men, executives from firms such as IG Farben, Krupp and Thyssen, were already preparing for life after Hitler. Their fortunes, much of it extracted through slave labor and plundered resources, had been quietly transferred into accounts in Zurich, Vaduz, and Stockholm. Safe behind neutral borders, these funds could be redeployed to rebuild influence, provided they survived the storm of Allied retribution. Documents unearthed in post-war investigations confirmed that millions in Reichsmarks and gold bullion moved across borders during 1944 and 1945, often facilitated by sympathetic bankers who saw no reason to let morality interfere with profit. The most disturbing aspect of these secret understandings lies not in their existence, but in their consequences. At Nuremberg, the world was told that justice would be impartial, that those responsible for crimes against humanity would face punishment regardless of position or power. Yet the records of Allied intelligence paint a more cynical picture. While men like Göring and Ribbentrop stood trial, others, just as complicit, were quietly spared. Certain industrialists, such as Alfred Krupp, convicted of using forced labor, saw their sentences commuted within years. By the 1950s, Krupp was once again at the helm of his steel empire, supplying NATO armies. IG Farben executives implicated in medical experiments and mass exploitation received light sentences, many returning to senior positions in West German corporations that would become household names. The secret guarantees struck in 1945 had paid off. What was promised in the shadows materialized in post-war boardrooms. A declassified cable dated March 1945, marked OSS Bern, reveals discussions of safeguarding industrial and financial assets of select German nationals for potential post-conflict stabilization. The wording is vague, but the intent is clear. Elements within Allied command believed that Germany's industrial expertise was too valuable to be entirely dismantled. Instead, it would be harnessed, redirected against the Soviet Union, the emerging adversary of the new Cold War. In this calculus, justice for victims of Nazi atrocities became secondary to geopolitical strategy. Executives who oversaw factories at Auschwitz or Mauthausen were no longer war criminals. They were potential allies in the coming struggle against communism. The Vatican, too, played an ambiguous role. Documents from the so-called rat lines show how clergy facilitated the escape of certain SS officers to South America, often with tacit Allied knowledge. Men like Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, slipped through Europe with false papers, eventually finding work with Western intelligence agencies during the Cold War. Barbie's value lay not in morality, but in his knowledge of Soviet infiltration and resistance networks. Each case reflected the same underlying bargain. In exchange for intelligence, perpetrators could buy survival. These compromises, struck in the ashes of Europe, created a shadow network of former Nazis and collaborators embedded within Western power structures. The secrecy of these arrangements is reinforced by the gaps in official archives. Files once held by the US Office of Strategic Services, later absorbed into the CIA, remain heavily redacted. Pages that might reveal names, dates, or sums are marked with thick black ink or stamped "withheld in the interest of national security." British Foreign Office records from 1945 to 1950 tell a similar story. Requests for full declassification have been denied on grounds that releasing the material could damage international relations. What international relations, decades after the fall of the Reich, could be endangered by these files? The answer points not to the Nazis themselves, but to the Western institutions that profited from their survival. Switzerland's role adds another disturbing dimension. Long regarded as neutral, the Swiss banking sector became the clearinghouse for Nazi wealth. After the war, Allied negotiators attempted to force the return of looted assets, particularly gold stolen from Jewish victims and occupied nations. Yet Swiss banks resisted, invoking client secrecy. Many of these accounts remained untouched for decades, their ownership hidden behind shell companies and false names. When the issue resurfaced in the 1990s, investigations revealed just how much wealth had been quietly preserved. shielded from both justice and restitution. The story of Switzerland's wartime neutrality is not one of innocence, but of calculated profit, enabled by deals struck in smoke-filled rooms while Europe bled. What makes the forbidden pact beneath the Reich so enduringly dangerous is its challenge to the narrative of absolute justice. If the victors of World War II were willing to negotiate with perpetrators, to shelter wealth built on slave labor, and to re-employ war criminals for political convenience, then the moral foundation of post-war order is compromised. The trials, the declarations of never again, become shadows cast to conceal the bargains struck behind closed doors. Every redacted page, every sealed vault in Bern or Washington, testifies not only to the crimes of the Reich, but to the willingness of its enemies to appropriate its power. Even decades later, the consequences ripple outward. The corporations rebuilt from the ashes of Nazi industry form part of today's global economic order. Their sanitized histories omit the war crimes of their founders. Political structures forged in the Cold War still rely on the intelligence networks seeded by ex-SS officers. Families who lost everything to Nazi plunder continue to fight for restitution, battling legal systems designed to protect the secrecy of banking empires. And the official histories of World War II, taught in classrooms and memorialized in museums, rarely mention the quiet deals that allowed parts of the Reich to endure in disguised forms. The reality revealed by these documents is not one of clean victory, but of compromise. It is the story of how power was preserved, wealth protected, and truth concealed to serve the ambitions of a new era. These arrangements, struck in the dying days of the Reich, remind us that history is not written only on battlefields, but in hidden negotiations where morality is traded for influence. And so long as those files remain redacted, so long as the full extent of these pacts is withheld, the forbidden truth of 1945 continues to haunt us, not as a closed chapter, but as a warning that silence can be more dangerous than defeat. Chapter 3: Erased Files of Operation Paperclip. When the guns of World War II fell silent in May 1945, the world celebrated the end of tyranny and the promise of justice. Yet in secret rooms across Europe, a different project was already unfolding, one that would permanently shape the Cold War. It bore the innocuous name Operation Paperclip, but its sanitized title concealed a morally corrosive reality. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and medical specialists, many deeply entangled in the machinery of the Third Reich, were quietly transported to the United States. They arrived not as prisoners, but as assets. Their pasts were scrubbed, their dossiers rewritten, and their knowledge repurposed for the building of a new superpower. While the Nuremberg trials promised accountability for war crimes, Paperclip offered amnesty in exchange for scientific expertise. In this Faustian bargain, the victors became custodians of knowledge extracted from terror, and the perpetrators became silent architects of America's future. The program began in earnest in July 1945, just weeks before the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With the war's end in sight, US military intelligence identified key figures within the Reich's scientific community who might serve American interests. Their talents ranged from advanced rocketry to aeronautical medicine, from chemical warfare to psychiatric experimentation. Werner von Braun, perhaps the most famous recruit, had overseen the V-2 rocket program at Peenemünde, where thousands of slave laborers from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp perished under inhuman conditions. Official records note that between 12,000 and 20,000 prisoners died, constructing the rockets that later fell on London and Antwerp. Yet when von Braun arrived in the United States, his connection to these atrocities was carefully erased. In public, he became a visionary scientist, celebrated for his role in building NASA's Saturn V rocket, the vehicle that carried men to the moon. His darker history was hidden beneath redacted files and altered biographies. The mechanics of concealment were deliberate and systematic. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, established to oversee Operation Paperclip, was tasked with sanitizing dossiers. Reports of SS affiliations, war crimes, or complicity in forced labor were quietly removed. One CIA memorandum from 1947 explicitly advised elimination of incriminating evidence to secure visas. Scientists who had worn SS uniforms were rebranded as mere technicians. Some who had experimented on human subjects were reframed as pioneers of aeronautical medicine. This rewriting of history was not accidental. It was official policy, driven by the fear that the Soviet Union would otherwise acquire these men. In the calculus of the Cold War, morality became negotiable, science priceless. Consider Hubertus Strughold, later dubbed the father of space medicine. During the war, Strughold was connected to Luftwaffe experiments conducted on prisoners at Dachau, where inmates were placed in freezing water tanks or subjected to low-pressure chambers that simulated high-altitude flight. Survivors described watching men convulse, suffocate, or freeze to death while physicians took notes. These findings later informed US studies on astronaut endurance and survival in extreme conditions. Strughold himself was shielded from scrutiny, granted citizenship, and honored by NASA. It was not until decades later, when fragments of Dachau records resurfaced, that questions about his past emerged. By then, the official narrative had long since enshrined him as a hero of American science. The Paperclip recruits did not merely blend into American research, they became pillars of it. At White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, von Braun and his team launched captured V-2 rockets under the supervision of the US Army. Their work laid the foundation for the Redstone and Jupiter rockets, crucial to America's early ballistic missile program. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, scientists previously involved in Nazi chemical warfare were consulted on nerve agents like sarin, first synthesized in Germany in 1938. Their expertise fed directly into America's chemical weapons arsenal, even as the Geneva Conventions condemned their use. At Wright Field in Ohio, Luftwaffe engineers contributed to supersonic jet design, shaping the future of US military aviation. The fingerprints of Paperclip spread across every branch of American defense, invisible yet undeniable. The true cost of this knowledge was measured not in dollars, but in justice denied. Survivors of concentration camp experiments were never given their day in court against the men whose research had scarred them. Testimonies presented at Nuremberg describing freezing experiments, mustard gas trials, and bone graft surgeries on unwilling prisoners were effectively ignored when the perpetrators were deemed useful. Officially, the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946-47 condemned such acts as crimes against humanity. Unofficially, US intelligence carved out exceptions, quietly escorting perpetrators across the Atlantic. In doing so, the Allies undermined their own promises, betraying the very principles they had claimed to defend. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, ran its own parallel program, capturing German scientists and relocating them to Moscow's research institutes. The race to secure Nazi expertise was less about justice than about supremacy in a new technological conflict. In this race, both sides compromised their morality, feeding off the remains of the Reich. For the United States, Paperclip was not only a scientific boon, but a propaganda shield. Publicly, America stood for freedom and justice. Privately, it was constructing its future on foundations of coerced labor, inhumane experimentation, and rewritten histories. It is this dissonance, the gap between rhetoric and reality, that continues to make Operation Paperclip one of the most disturbing legacies of the war. Declassified CIA records in the 1990s revealed just how far the deception went. Files stamped with references like A100 Werner von Braun dossier showed evidence of deliberate falsification. Marginal notes by JOA officers recommended altering dates of SS membership or omitting references to Mittelwerk slave labor. Even as Holocaust survivors testified to the horrors of Dora, American officials insisted that von Braun had been unaware of the conditions. The evidence says otherwise. Witnesses recalled him visiting the underground tunnels, stepping over corpses as he inspected rocket production. But these accounts were drowned out by the roar of Saturn V engines and the triumph of Apollo 11. What remains most unsettling is the continuity of this legacy. The data gathered under torture did not vanish. It was absorbed into the bloodstream of modern science. Medical protocols for hypothermia, high-altitude survival, and pressure endurance trace their origins to Dachau. Aerospace technology that carried astronauts into orbit emerged from designs tested on prisoners in Peenemünde. Even the ethical codes developed after the war, the Nuremberg Code of 1947, establishing consent in human experimentation, exist precisely because they were violated so thoroughly by the men later shielded under Paperclip. The paradox is inescapable. The crimes were acknowledged in principle, yet rewarded in practice. For decades, the US government denied the extent of Paperclip's compromises. Only with the declassification of records in the late 20th century did the scope become undeniable. Books, documentaries, and congressional inquiries confirmed what survivors had long suspected. that justice was sacrificed on the altar of national security. Still, many files remain sealed, and many names are unknown. How many more war criminals were imported, their pasts erased, their contributions buried under layers of patriotic myth? The truth is fragmented, scattered across redacted pages and missing archives. Operation Paperclip stands as a monument to the uneasy marriage of morality and power. It reveals how easily ideals can be bent when confronted with the promise of advantage, how swiftly justice can be traded for supremacy. It forces us to question the narratives of triumph that followed World War II, reminding us that victory was not always clean, and that some of the very men who engineered suffering became celebrated architects of progress. Their erased files continue to haunt the archives, silent testimony to the compromises made in the name of survival. And until those files are fully unsealed, until every name is revealed and every crime acknowledged, the forbidden truth of Operation Paperclip will remain a wound in the history of modern science, a wound still too dangerous to close. Chapter 4: Disturbing Legacy of Operation Gladio. In the aftermath of World War II, as Europe lay divided between East and West, the victors promised security, reconstruction, and the defense of democracy. Yet buried beneath this public commitment was a hidden project, an operation so secretive that its existence was denied for decades, and when revealed, it shook governments to their core. It bore the codename Gladio, a NATO-directed stay-behind network intended to wage guerrilla war in case of a Soviet invasion. To the public, it sounded like preparedness, but declassified files, parliamentary inquiries, and the testimonies of intelligence officers reveal a far more disturbing reality. What began as a defensive plan evolved into something darker, a clandestine structure that manipulated domestic politics, infiltrated extremist groups, and may have sanctioned acts of terror against civilians. Operation Gladio was not merely about defending Europe from Moscow, it was about controlling Europe itself. The network took shape in the late 1940s, under the supervision of the CIA and Britain's MI6. Arms caches were hidden in forests, barns, and underground bunkers from Italy to Belgium, from Greece to West Germany. Volunteers, often with military or partisan backgrounds, were secretly trained in sabotage, explosives, and guerrilla tactics. In theory, they would serve as resistance cells if Soviet tanks rolled across the Iron Curtain. In practice, many of these recruits were drawn from far-right and former fascist circles. Italian parliamentary reports later revealed that ex-blackshirts, monarchists, and ultra-nationalists were given covert support, deemed reliable because of their vehement anti-communism. Already, the moral compromises of Gladio were clear. To fight one totalitarian threat, Western intelligence was willing to empower the remnants of another. The turning point came not from a Soviet invasion, but from internal unrest. In Italy, during the 1960s and 1970s, political polarization reached a breaking point. Communist parties gained electoral ground, threatening to enter government. Labor strikes spread across factories. Student protests challenged the status quo. In this climate, a campaign of violence erupted. Bombings, shootings, assassinations that tore at the fabric of Italian society. Officially, these acts were blamed on left-wing extremists. Yet, declassified Italian intelligence files and testimony from magistrates point to a different story. Many of the perpetrators were connected to Gladio's stay-behind network. This strategy was described chillingly as the strategia della tensione, the strategy of tension, by staging or facilitating acts of terror, then attributing them to communists. Gladio operatives sought to frighten the public and justify authoritarian responses. Fear, not freedom, became the weapon of choice. The Piazza Fontana bombing of December 12, 1969, marked one of the first major incidents. A bomb exploded at the headquarters of the National Agrarian Bank in Milan, killing 17 and wounding 88. Initial blame fell on anarchists, with arrests made swiftly. But years later, investigations uncovered links between the attack and far-right militants connected to Gladio. Similar patterns emerged in the Bologna train station massacre of 1980, which killed 85 and injured more than 200. Italian courts later found neo-fascist groups responsible, some of whose members were tied to intelligence structures overlapping with NATO's clandestine network. The evidence suggested that Gladio was not a passive defense mechanism. It was an active force shaping political outcomes through bloodshed. Belgium and Germany were not exempt. In the 1980s, Belgium was rocked by the so-called Brabant massacres, a series of supermarket shootings leaving 28 dead. The attackers, masked and heavily armed, vanished without trace. Rumors swirled of Gladio involvement, fueled by revelations of secret arms caches discovered in the countryside. In Germany, the exposure of stay-behind arms depots in the 1990s raised similar suspicions. While definitive proof remains buried under layers of classification, the consistency of these operations across multiple countries suggests a pattern too vast to ignore. Wherever the communist threat loomed, Gladio networks stood ready not only to resist invasion, but to manipulate domestic order. The secrecy surrounding Gladio persisted until 1990, when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti was forced to admit its existence under parliamentary questioning. The revelation caused a political earthquake. Documents surfaced, detailing meetings of NATO's clandestine committees, such as the Allied Clandestine Committee, ACC, and the Clandestine Planning Committee, CPC, where the stay-behind networks were coordinated. What shocked the public was not the defensive concept itself, but the extent to which these structures had blurred into domestic politics, with almost no democratic oversight. Italy launched parliamentary investigations. Belgium and Switzerland conducted inquiries of their own, but many files remained classified, many names concealed. The deeper questions: who authorized acts of terror, who controlled the flow of weapons, who decided when fear should be unleashed, were left unanswered. Declassified CIA memoranda from the early 1950s show awareness of Gladio's potential for manipulation. One noted the political utility of the networks in countering communist influence. Another stressed the importance of maintaining plausible deniability in case operations were exposed. MI6 archives, heavily redacted, indicate coordination with British Special Forces in training operatives in sabotage and psychological warfare. Taken together, these documents suggest that Gladio was never merely a defensive insurance policy. It was also a lever of control, wielded in moments when democratic outcomes threatened Western strategic interests. The disturbing legacy of Operation Gladio lies not only in the violence attributed to it, but in the trust it shattered. Citizens believed their governments existed to protect them, yet evidence points to scenarios where those same governments may have sanctioned or at least tolerated violence against their own people for political ends. Survivors of bombings, families of the dead, and communities scarred by terror still demand clarity, but full accountability has never come. NATO has never issued a comprehensive account of Gladio. The CIA maintains silence. European governments, when pressed, offer fragmented admissions, followed by silence. It is as though an invisible hand reached into the heart of democracy, left blood on the streets, and then withdrew, leaving only denial. Even today, the implications remain too dangerous to fully confront. If Western governments used fear and terror to manipulate their populations during the Cold War, what does that say about the legitimacy of their systems? How much of the post-war narrative of freedom versus tyranny was constructed, not in open debate, but in secret operations designed to control outcomes? And most haunting of all, how much of this clandestine architecture still exists, rebranded, hidden in the folds of counter-terrorism or intelligence operations of the 21st century? Operation Gladio teaches us that the battle for control does not always occur at borders. Sometimes it unfolds in train stations, banks, and supermarkets, places where ordinary lives intersect with invisible strategies. Its legacy lingers not in the archives alone, but in the silence of governments unwilling to expose their own betrayals. To remember Gladio is to confront a truth still deemed too dangerous to admit: that democracy itself can be manipulated from within, using methods indistinguishable from those of the enemies it claimed to fight. The secrets unearthed here do not rest easily in the past. They continue to radiate into the present, reshaping how we understand war, justice, and the fragile line between security and betrayal. From the frozen experiments of Unit 731 to the shadowy pacts that spared Nazi wealth, from the erased files of Operation Paperclip to the disturbing manipulations of Operation Gladio, each revelation reminds us that truth was often sacrificed in silence. Governments spoke of freedom, justice, and peace, while in hidden archives they preserved evidence of atrocity, compromise, and deceit. The legacy of these forbidden files is not simply historical, it is ongoing, buried in classified vaults and redacted documents still withheld under claims of national security. What else lies hidden, waiting to be declassified or destroyed before it can ever be known? How many more names, dates, and signatures have been erased so the myth of clean victory remains intact? The war may have ended in 1945, but the shadows it cast stretch forward into our time. To confront these secrets is to accept that the line between protector and perpetrator has always been thinner than we are told, and that some truths remain too dangerous to be spoken aloud.